Hello, everyone. Today we're going to get into the 1960s with the Kennedy and the Johnson years. So if you want to follow along, this is just the Kennedy and Johnson years PowerPoint. Now, at the beginning of the decade, 1960, Kennedy is elected president. The politics of expectation and triumph of the liberal consensus occur. That's kind of what JFK's politics, the politics of expectation was referred to as. This is the greatest period of liberal reform since the New Deal. You have civil rights, although Republicans made that possible. Medicare, the Great Society, the war on poverty. Fast forward to 1968, the liberal consensus is in disarray. JFK, Robert Kennedy, his younger brother, Martin Luther King Jr. have all been assassinated. Lyndon Johnson does not seek another term. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago breaks down into violence. So basically, the start of the 60s is great for the Democrats and the liberals, and then by the end of the decade, they're in utter chaos. Okay, so 1960, you have John F. Kennedy running for election against Richard M. Nixon. They have similar backgrounds. Both were born in the 20th century. They're the first people to be president that are born in the 20th century. They both were in the Navy during World War II. They're both elected to Congress in the 1940s and then elected to the Senate in the 1950s. Both are known as anti-communist crusaders. But they also have backgrounds that are not so similar. JFK is the son of a wealthy businessman. His grandfather was ambassador to England. He attends Harvard. JFK has a very pampered upbringing. Maybe not pampered, just rich. JFK, I think, was a tough person, but he has a rich upbringing. Nixon is the son of a poor father. Who struggles to survive. He had to sacrifice his choice of college to kind of help the family and help the family get by. Nixon gave up a lot of opportunities. Nixon's a lot of times considered the most intellectual president we've ever had, or one of them. The election of 1960 is the first one with televised debates. There's 4 debates, 70 million people watch. Before the debate, the first one, Nixon had been in the hospital and he's exhausted. He doesn't have makeup put on him. Kennedy looks tan and healthy. So the results, if you watched the debates on TV and you were polled, you tended to think that Kennedy won. If you listened to the debates on the radio and you were polled, you tended to say that Nixon won. I've got some clips there of some of the debates. It's a very close election. JFK wins 49.7% of the vote to 49.5% of the vote. Just over 100,000 votes separate them. A lot of historians believe that Mayor Richard Daley in Chicago provided the necessary votes to push JFK over the top. There might have even been some stuff going on in Texas with Lyndon Johnson kind of stealing votes. Nixon thinks about challenging the election, but Eisenhower says, don't do that. Don't look like a sore loser. You can just run again later and maybe you'll win. In JFK's inaugural address, he famously says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. JFK's team gets referred to as the best and the brightest. So all these very ambitious, talented, intellectual people are seen as joining his administration. A lot of them are seen as pretty young too. JFK's Cold War policy is called flexible response. Basically, he wants to be ready for a conventional war or a nuclear war. Eisenhower's new look had focused on nuclear supremacy, and it was cost effective, but JFK's flexible response increases conventional military while also using nuclear weapons. Sorry. He says the United States must be prepared to deter all wars, general or limited, nuclear or conventional, large or small. The beginning of JFK's administration goes horribly because of the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1959, the communists took over Cuba. Fidel Castro, a communist, ousted the dictator there. He nationalizes billions of dollars worth of American assets. Eisenhower kind of has this plan to overthrow him using Cuban exiles that are trained, and then they'll invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. JFK becomes president and he gives the green light to invade. You can kind of see on slide 12 where the Bay of Pigs is. In April of 1961, the Cuban exiles attack. JFK removes the air support from the attack. The invasion flounders. Everyone is either killed or captured. So JFK's first foreign policy move is seen as a huge blunder. Some of the other things he does, though, are seen as more successful. He starts the Peace Corps. The State Department has an agency for international development. The Alliance for Progress is a plan to invest money into the Americas, the countries of Latin America, to kind of help build up their infrastructure and their economies so that they don't turn towards communism. Kind of think of it as a Marshall Plan for Latin America. Later on in 1961, Kennedy goes and visits Khrushchev. Now remember, Khrushchev did have good relations with Eisenhower until the U-2 incident, and then things kind of soured. Well, Kennedy kind of has to pick up the pieces. JFK gets bullied by Khrushchev at Vienna. Khrushchev sees JFK as this young guy who looks like he's just out of college, doesn't know anything, so he pushes him around. And JFK basically said, Khrushchev had his way with me at this conference. But JFK is going to show some strength here in a minute. Dealing with Berlin, Berlin is still an issue. Berlin is losing a lot of people. Tons of people are leaving East Berlin and East Germany to go to West Germany. I got some quotes up here on slide 18. Even the communists admitted that they had a problem in East Berlin because you've got capitalist West Berlin. It's prosperous, it's free, and then you've got socialist or communist East Berlin. It doesn't have freedom, it has a terrible economy, no hope for the people who live there. So even the communists know they have a problem. In 1958, while Eisenhower was still president, Khrushchev issued an ultimatum. He threatens to end the occupation of the Western powers in Berlin. Khrushchev often calls Berlin the testicles of the West. He says, all I have to do is squeeze and they'll scream. But Berlin is also a problem for the Soviet Union. If you look at slides 20, 21, and 22, you can see how lots of people are leaving East Germany. So millions of people are fleeing East Germany to go to the West. So what ends up happening is Khrushchev builds the Berlin Wall to keep people from leaving East Berlin. If you look at slide 23, I got a really great video. Just click on that YouTube video. It's a few minutes. It's really important to watch. It kind of gives you a feel for what it's like. It shows people trying to escape. It's a pretty good video. Khrushchev says, the wall was a hateful thing, but what should I have done? More than 30,000 people, in fact, the best and most qualified people from the GDR, left the country in July. The East German economy would have collapsed if we hadn't done something soon against the mass flight, so the wall was the only remaining option. JFK basically said, we never had to build a wall to keep people from leaving our country. JFK responds by sending troops into West Berlin. Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, and Lucius Clay, kind of the hero of the Berlin blockade. He goes to Berlin. There's a standoff. It ends peacefully, though. JFK goes to Berlin in 1963 and gives his famous Berlin speech. If you look at slide 26, you can see the German and the American tanks kind of standing off from each other. The biggest problem, though, in JFK's administration, foreign policy-wise, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the spring of 1962, 40,000 American soldiers invade an island in the Caribbean. Cuba sees this as a practice run for invading Cuba. And, JFK already tried once, so who's to think he's not going to try again? So Castro goes to Khrushchev and says, I need basically a bigger brother to protect us. Russia agrees to put missiles on Cuba as a deterrence from American intervention. Soviet ships arrive with missiles and about 40,000 soldiers. In October 1962, a U-2 plane flies over Cuba, and soon the Americans know that the Russians are building missile bases in Cuba. So why did Khrushchev do this? Khrushchev basically says, I wanted to protect Cuba from an American invasion, and I also wanted to spread communism in Latin America. A lot of the Cold War, a lot of people in the third world, they kind of gravitate towards who's the most powerful. So showing that you're powerful is a good way to get people on your side. Well, if there's a Soviet nuclear missile base in the Caribbean. Maybe that will kind of shore up the morale of the communists there. Khrushchev also wanted to restore the balance of power. If you look at slides 29 and 30, you can see that America, or NATO, I guess I should say it's NATO, has tons of missiles in Europe that could hit Moscow at any moment. The Americans even put some new missiles in Turkey, the Jupiter missiles. So basically, our missiles, the United States missiles, can hit Russia really quickly, but if Russia wants to bomb the United States, it would take a long time. So putting missiles on Cuba will restore this balance of power. So what ends up happening is Kennedy learns about this, and he basically has to decide what to do. Should he use airstrikes? Should he invade? Should he do a quarantine, blockade Cuba? Should he wait and see what happens, take a more diplomatic approach? Khrushchev refuses to back down, and what ends up happening is JFK decides on a quarantine. He blockades the island of Cuba, doesn't let any more Soviet missiles come in. There's even a confrontation at the United Nations. If you watch the YouTube link on slide 37, you can see this confrontation at the United Nations. So what ends up happening is we blockade Cuba. The Americans stop an oil tanker from Russia. It's actually called the Bucharest. Khrushchev contacts JFK through back party channels, and both sides agree that they need to kind of calm down, and the Cuban Missile Crisis gets resolved. Russia agrees to take the missiles and the soldiers out of Cuba. JFK pledges not to invade Cuba. Secretly, JFK promises to take the missiles out of Turkey. This doesn't go public, so it seems like JFK made a good move, kind of came out on top, but he secretly promises stuff to the Russians as well. A hotline is later established so that the two nations can talk to each other. JFK ends up giving a speech at the American University, and he says, I want to curb nuclear arms, I want a test ban treaty. And what ends up happening is you have this happen in 1963, you get a partial nuclear test ban treaty. So that's something Eisenhower and Khrushchev were kind of working on, but because of the U-2 crisis, that gets put on hold, but then JFK kind of accomplishes it. On the domestic front, Kennedy's kind of policies are called the New Frontier. He focuses on the economy, civil rights, education, healthcare, and the space program. And I should say, I throw civil rights in there. He does speak out for civil rights, but he's kind of lukewarm about it. So kind of take that with a grain of salt. JFK cut taxes. He famously says, rising tides raise all boats. So if you're out in the water and the economy goes up, the water goes up, everyone does well, whether you're in a little boat or a yacht. He increases military spending. He increases space exploration. It's due to him that we put a man on the moon at the end of the decade. But JFK is assassinated in 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes the new president. Lyndon Johnson uses JFK's death to push for civil rights. We've already talked about that with the civil rights movement, but the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I already talked to you about how Lyndon Johnson opposed civil rights while he was in power in the Senate, but then when he becomes president, he pushes for it. His Great Society is this war on poverty. Johnson wants to be kind of the biggest New Dealer since FDR. He grew up during the New Deal, so he knows what it did for him. He creates Medicare and Medicaid, which is health care for the elderly and the poor. He kind of entered Congress in the 1930s. He's elected as a New Deal Democrat. He uses federal money to help farmers out to increase education spending, public libraries, roads, the Great Dam on the Colorado River. He brings electricity to parts of Texas, but he is an opponent of civil rights while he's in Congress and the Senate. In 1941, he runs for the Senate, and he has the election stolen from him. So he should have been the United States Senator from Texas, but the election gets stolen from him. Later on in 1948, he runs for election to the Senate, and he ends up stealing votes this time. So if you look at slide 62, that little box that says Precinct 13. Supposedly those were the stolen votes. So LBJ is a very shrewd politician. He knows how to get things done. Because he barely wins this last election, or sorry, his first election that he wins to the Senate, the one that he helped steal or his handlers stole for him, he gets the nickname Landslide Lyndon because they only stole it by 87 votes. So that's kind of funny, I think. He becomes the youngest ever majority leader in the Senate in the 1950s. He's one of the most powerful senators, and then he becomes vice president. JFK is seen as this kind of liberal, northeastern kind of elite person. So when JFK runs for president, he kind of gets a supposedly like kind of good old boy Texan Southern Democrat to kind of balance the ticket, and then he becomes president. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson has to run for election. He runs against Barry Goldwater, the staunch conservative or kind of libertarian candidate from senator from Arizona. If you look at slide 68, there's a famous campaign ad. I'd like you to watch that. Basically, Johnson portrays Lyndon Johnson as this crazy extremist who's going to start World War III. Johnson promises, the Vietnam War is kind of in the background. Johnson promises, I won't send anybody to fight. I'm not going to send American boys to fight Asian boys as wars. That's what he says to the American people. LBJ says, my biggest fear is that Barry Goldwater will make me look soft on communism and blame me for losing Vietnam. Remember, Republicans and some Democrats blame Truman for losing China. So basically, no president wants to be the country that loses, or no president wants to be the president that loses a country to communism. Barry Goldwater gives a famous speech where he says, tolerance in the face of tyranny is no virtue, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. Ronald Reagan gives a famous speech, A Time for Choosing. Ronald Reagan kind of gets catapulted to the national stage because of this election. If you look at slide 73, Goldwater gets trounced. It's a huge landslide. LBJ wins over 61% of the vote. And if you look at something, you'll notice that Goldwater wins Arizona, his home state, and then the Deep South. Goldwater, this is kind of ironic. Goldwater opposes federal laws on civil rights. He doesn't think the federal government should tell you what to do with your own business. He's kind of a libertarian-sided conservative. He doesn't think the federal government should tell you who you can associate with. You know, the freedom of association is something that's very important to him. And he basically, in a roundabout way, says, if you are a black person and you don't want to associate with a white, you shouldn't have to. If you're white and you don't want to associate with a black, you shouldn't have to. But here's the thing. Goldwater is a very big supporter of civil rights. He is active in his local NAACP. He doesn't have a racist bone in his body. So he's very not racial, but he opposes it just based on kind of those libertarian conservative principles of I don't want the government to have too much power. Meanwhile, Lyndon Johnson is very racist privately, even publicly sometimes. He opposed civil rights openly most of his life. He supports the civil rights laws, like I said earlier, maybe because he believed in it, but also because he saw blacks as a large voting bloc. So either way, Goldwater opposes the civil rights, kind of the national legislation, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he gets trounced in the election. Lyndon Johnson shovels out a ton of money to domestic programs. He gives tons of money to schools through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act. He enacts Medicare and Medicaid to give health care to the elderly and the poor. He focuses on the environment. Something called the Highway Beautification Act gets passed. If you used to drive down the interstates, you would just see trash everywhere. They start cleaning up America's roads. He abandons the quota system from the 1920s immigration laws. So the Immigration Act of 65 kind of does away with these quotas. And he just shores up the New Deal in general. passes economic reform such as the Economic Opportunity Act. It is seen as a way for the government to kind of help people find jobs or help people out of work or help people with kids. So you got like Head Start, the Job Corps, Upward Bound, Volunteers in Service to America. Now, what ended up happening is while Lyndon Johnson is trying to get his domestic agenda finished and passed and just kind of make America better, the Vietnam War intervenes, and he famously said, "That bitch of a war killed the lady I loved, the Great Society." Um, if I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved with that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home. But if I left that war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward, and my nation would see me as an appeaser. So what ends up happening is the Great Society, the war on poverty, gets pushed to the sidelines, and Lyndon Johnson focuses on fighting the war in Vietnam, and we'll kind of talk about that in another lecture.